It shows a classroom that is almost too still. Wooden desks aligned with a precision that feels intentional rather than casual. A chalkboard behind them, already half erased, as if someone had been interrupted in the middle of explaining something and never returned to finish the thought. At the center stands a woman. She is not posed like a portrait. Her posture suggests movement that has been paused rather than arranged. One hand rests near a stack of papers. The other is slightly raised, not in greeting, not in instruction, but in the middle space between both. As if she had been speaking and then decided not to continue. The record attached to the photograph identifies her only as schoolteacher, District Archive Reference 14B. No full name is given, no biography follows, only a date and a location that has since been absorbed into a modern administrative boundary that no longer uses the same designation. On the desk in front of her, faint writing can be seen on a slate page. The handwriting is not fully legible in the reproduction, but certain words remain visible. Before, revision, and lower down, do not repeat. The rest is lost to time or deliberate erasure is impossible to determine from the document alone. What is clear is that the photograph was not taken for documentation of routine schooling. It was taken in a moment where documentation itself seems uncertain of its purpose. And that is where the record begins, not with certainty, but with interruption. In the same archive, there are several unrelated school records from the same period. Different regions, different administrators, different educational boards. Yet when placed side by side, a pattern begins to form slowly, without announcement. Lesson plans begin to shift in language. Older versions of curricula describe subjects in a descriptive way. Local history, oral accounts, regional events, passed down knowledge. Later versions, within a span of a few years, begin to simplify those same sections. The phrasing becomes standardized. Names are removed or replaced with broader categories. Entire segments of narrative history are condensed into short paragraphs that emphasize chronology over interpretation. At first, this appears to be administrative efficiency, a natural evolution of education systems moving toward uniformity, but in one set of teaching notes attributed to an unnamed instructor in 1901, there is a marginal annotation that stands apart from the rest. It reads, "They asked us to keep only what can be examined." There is no signature beneath it, only a pencil mark, slightly smudged, as if the hand that wrote it paused mid-pressure. To understand the significance of that note, it is necessary to look at the broader landscape of education at the turn of the 20th century. Across industrializing nations, schooling was undergoing transformation. The idea of a standardized curriculum was becoming increasingly common. Education was no longer purely local or familial, it was becoming institutional. In the United States, state-level boards began to align textbooks across districts. In parts of Europe, centralized education models were refining what could be taught at each grade level. In colonial systems, curricula were often aligned with administrative priorities rather than regional memory. On paper, this was progress. Literacy was expanding. Access to education was increasing. Methods were becoming consistent. But consistency often comes at a cost that is not immediately visible. In one correspondence between two educators, preserved but partially redacted, there is mention of approved historical framing and non-essential narrative removal. The phrasing is bureaucratic, almost indifferent. Yet within it lies a quiet transformation. History is no longer only what is remembered. It is what is selected to be remembered. The schoolteacher from 1901 appears again in a second document, this time a formal inspection report. The inspector notes that her classroom was unusually attentive to older oral accounts and that instruction occasionally diverged from prescribed materials. There is no disciplinary action recorded, only a recommendation, align instruction with approved text for consistency. It is a sentence that reads as procedural, but in the margin of the same report, written in a different hand, is a short observation. She speaks as though there were two histories. No explanation follows. No clarification is offered. The archive does not expand on what this means. To move further into the pattern, one must consider the nature of textbooks themselves during this period. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw rapid expansion of printed educational materials. Publishing houses became closely linked to education boards. Standard texts were distributed across regions that previously relied on localized instruction. This did not happen abruptly. It was gradual, structured, and widely supported by the idea that education should be unified. But when narratives are unified, variation becomes invisible. In one early textbook revision record, a line is struck through in ink before publication. The removed passage refers to regional accounts of origin stories and alternative civic narratives. The editor's note simply states, "Not aligned with current framework." No further justification is given. It is here that the pattern begins to emerge more clearly, not as a deliberate act of concealment, but as a steady narrowing of what is considered necessary to know. The schoolteacher of 1901, whether as a single individual or as a representation of many unnamed instructors of her time, exists within this narrowing. Her reported hesitation in instruction is recorded in a second inspection note. The teacher pauses before certain historical segments. Students appear engaged but uncertain of expectation. Again, there is no accusation, only observation. And yet the tone suggests something subtle, that uncertainty itself had become noteworthy. At this point, the archive shifts from institutional records to personal fragments. A collection of student notes preserved in a damaged ledger contains copied phrases from classroom instruction. Among them, repeated entries appear. Ask again later. This is not in our book. We were told not to expand on that period. The repetition is important. It suggests not a single restriction, but a learned pattern of limitation, a curriculum not only delivered, but absorbed as boundary. The schoolteacher's name still does not appear, but her presence is increasingly implied through absence in the record of instruction. What she taught is partially visible. What she was prevented from teaching is only visible through omission, and omission in historical study is never neutral. As the timeline moves forward into the early 20th century, broader institutional changes become visible. Education ministries and boards begin issuing more detailed guidelines. Subjects are categorized more precisely. History becomes divided into eras with strict boundaries. The transition between periods is defined more by administrative decision than by interpretive continuity. This creates clarity, but also segmentation. In one policy document, the phrase "standardized historical narrative" appears for the first time in the archive. It is not explained further. No rationale is provided within the text itself. The assumption is that its meaning is self-evident. Around this same period, teacher training programs expand significantly. Instructional methodology becomes formalized. Educators are trained not only in subject matter, but in approved delivery formats. In one training manual, a line stands out. Deviation from established sequence may result in confusion of foundational understanding. Confusion in this context is treated as an educational risk, but confusion is also where questions begin. And questions, once introduced into structured systems, tend to resist containment. Returning to the schoolteacher, there is one final reference in the archive. A transfer document dated late 1901 indicates that she was reassigned. No reason is listed. No evaluation score is attached, only a note. Instructional alignment achieved through redistribution. She is moved to a different district. After this, the record ends. There are no further documents directly linked to her teaching, only the continued evolution of the system around her, and that system continues to refine itself. By the early decades of the 20th century, education becomes increasingly centralized in many regions. Curriculum boards expand. Textbook approval processes become formalized. Historical content is reviewed, edited, and reissued in cycles that emphasize consistency. This is not presented as suppression. It is presented as improvement, efficiency, coherence. But coherence always requires selection, and selection always implies exclusion. In examining these shifts, one begins to notice that the most significant transformations are not dramatic events. They are incremental adjustments in phrasing, structure, and emphasis. A paragraph shortened, a story omitted, a term replaced with a more general one. Over time, these small changes accumulate into something larger than their individual parts. a version of history that feels complete because it is uniform, not necessarily because it is total. In administrative correspondence from the period, one phrase appears repeatedly across different regions: ensure alignment with current historical understanding. Understanding here is treated as a fixed state rather than a developing process, and yet history by its nature is never fully fixed. It is reconstructed continuously from fragments, interpretations, and surviving records. Which brings us back to the classroom photograph. The woman standing at the center, the chalkboard partially erased, the note, "Do not repeat." What remains uncertain is not whether she existed in that room, but what exactly was considered unrepeatable. In later years, educational historians reviewing early 20th century curriculum transitions note a phenomenon that appears across multiple regions independently. Students transitioning between older and newer systems often describe a sense that something was once taught differently but no longer is. These accounts are not uniform enough to form a single conclusion, but they are consistent enough to be recorded. In one compiled report, an analyst writes, "It is not that knowledge disappears entirely, it changes shape until its earlier form is no longer recognizable as knowledge at all." That statement is not framed as alarm, it is framed as observation, and observation in archival language is often the final stage before normalization. As the system matures, the earlier irregularities fade into background noise. Older textbooks are withdrawn, revised editions replace them. Archival materials are cataloged and reclassified. The schoolteacher of 1901 becomes less a person and more a reference point in administrative history. Early transitional instruction phase. That is how she is eventually labeled in summary documentation, not as an individual, but as part of a process. And yet the photograph remains, still stored, still cataloged, still unchanged in its composition, a classroom, a teacher, a moment where instruction appears to have paused between what is known and what is permitted to be said. Returning to it now, more than a century later, the details become less about what is missing and more about what is present. The arrangement of desks, the half-erased chalk, the posture of hesitation that is neither resistance nor compliance, but something in between, and the final question, which the archive does not answer but quietly leaves open. When instruction changes, what exactly is being revised? The content, or the boundary of what content is allowed to remain visible at all? The archive does not respond to that question directly, it rarely does. Instead, what follows in the records is something more subtle. A shift in tone, almost imperceptible at first, as if the system itself had learned how to avoid certain lines of inquiry without ever acknowledging that avoidance was happening. In later educational summaries, the phrase curriculum refinement becomes more frequent. Earlier documents would describe updates as revisions or updates. Now the language leans toward refinement, as though the material was not being changed in substance but polished toward an ideal form that already existed. And yet, when comparing editions side by side, the differences are not cosmetic, they are structural. Entire sections of contextual explanation are reduced to brief statements. Narrative passages are compressed into factual sequences. Localized historical references are generalized into broader categories that fit more easily into standardized assessment. A historian reviewing these changes many decades later writes a note in the margin of her own analysis. The structure of explanation changes faster than the facts themselves. That sentence becomes important because it suggests that what is being shaped is not only information, but the way information is allowed to behave inside a classroom. In the early 1900s, a second generation of educators emerges, those who were trained entirely within the standardized system. They have no direct memory of the earlier instructional styles. To them, the revised curriculum is not a revision at all. It is simply the curriculum. This is where the transformation becomes most stable, not when something is removed, but when its absence is no longer recognized as absence. In one teacher training evaluation from the period, an instructor notes that candidates are highly consistent in delivery, but less likely to expand beyond prescribed material even when prompted. The evaluation does not mark this as failure, it marks it as success, because in the logic of institutional systems, predictability is often valued above exploration, and exploration by its nature introduces variability. Variability requires interpretation. Interpretation requires permission. Over time, permission becomes embedded in structure rather than explicitly stated. A classroom does not need to be told what cannot be said if the materials never present the conditions for saying it in the first place. The schoolteacher from 1901, when reappearing in later archival references, is occasionally mentioned in retrospective educational reports, never by name, only by function. Example of transitional instructional methodology during standardization phase. Her classroom is described as productive, but inconsistent with emerging uniform frameworks. There is no record of her objection, no record of her defense, only the administrative decision to relocate her instruction, but there is a separate fragment in a student recollection, recorded years later during an oral history project. The student describes her not as inconsistent, but as careful. She would pause, the account says, before certain pages, not because she did not know them, but because she seemed to be choosing whether knowing them in that moment was part of the lesson. This distinction is important because it suggests awareness of structure, not resistance, but recognition, and recognition is often the first step in noticing that instruction is not only about content, but about timing, emphasis, and omission. As the decades progress, educational systems continue to stabilize. By the mid-20th century, most regions with formal schooling have established tightly controlled curricula, regularly updated through centralized committees. These committees are often composed of historians, educators, and policy advisors. Their role is not described as restricting knowledge, but organizing it. Organization, in this sense, becomes the dominant framework. Knowledge must be structured to be accessible, but structure inevitably shapes interpretation. In one committee transcript from a curriculum review session, a member raises a concern. If we simplify further, we risk losing the connective tissue between periods. The response is calm, procedural. The purpose of instruction is not to preserve all connections, but to ensure comprehension of designated outcomes. The word designated is where the shift becomes visible again, because designation implies selection, and selection implies boundaries. The earlier classroom photograph of 1901 becomes, in this context, more than a record of a teacher. It becomes an artifact of an instructional moment before designation fully stabilized. In the photograph, the chalkboard remains partially erased. Later analysis of similar classroom images suggests that boards were often cleared at the end of lessons, but in this case the erasure appears incomplete, as if interrupted. Some archival analysts interpret this as coincidence. Others note that interruptions in educational documentation are often where procedural transitions become visible, not as disruption, but as timing. There is another document in the archive less formal than the rest, a letter exchange between two educators whose names are partially redacted. One writes, "I am no longer certain whether we are teaching history or teaching agreement with history." The response is shorter. They are not always separate. That exchange is not presented with commentary. It is simply filed under professional correspondence and archived without emphasis. But it introduces a tension that runs quietly beneath the entire system, because agreement is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not always required for agreement to function. By the early 20th century, textbook publishing has become highly coordinated with educational authorities. Drafts are reviewed in multiple stages. Content is checked not only for accuracy, but for alignment with curricular structure. In one revision note, an editor writes, "This section introduces unnecessary ambiguity in interpretation. The passage is removed. No further explanation is recorded." Ambiguity in educational systems is often treated as a risk, but ambiguity is also where interpretation begins to expand beyond fixed boundaries. Without it, knowledge becomes directional rather than exploratory. It moves forward, but not outward. In the training manuals of the period, instructional clarity is emphasized repeatedly. Teachers are encouraged to present material in structured progression. Each concept builds on the previous one in a controlled sequence. Deviation is discouraged, not through prohibition but through framing. Unstructured elaboration may hinder standardized assessment outcomes. Assessment becomes the measure of instruction, and instruction begins to align itself with what can be measured. What cannot be measured becomes secondary, or eventually irrelevant. Yet within archival student notebooks from various regions, traces of earlier interpretive styles still appear. Marginal notes, questions that extend beyond the lesson. Attempts to connect topics across chapters in ways not explicitly outlined. One notebook contains a simple question written in the margin of a history lesson. Why did the earlier book describe this differently? There is no answer recorded beneath it, only a line drawn through the question in later review. The schoolteacher from 1901 in this expanded context becomes less of an isolated figure and more of a threshold, a point where two instructional philosophies briefly overlap, one still allowing interpretive movement, the other moving toward structural consistency, neither fully separate yet, but not entirely aligned. As the archive approaches mid-century records, the language becomes even more standardized. Educational outcomes are described in increasingly abstract terms: competency, proficiency, alignment. History as a subject becomes segmented into manageable units. Events are presented in isolation unless explicitly required to demonstrate causality. The connective tissue mentioned earlier is no longer assumed. It must be constructed deliberately within defined parameters, and so over time students are trained not only in content but in structure recognition. They learn how information is expected to appear, how it is framed, and how it is assessed. In one later pedagogical study, an observer notes, students demonstrate strong recall of presented material, but limited tendency to question the framing of that material. The word framing is used carefully. It does not imply distortion, only arrangement, and arrangement in institutional systems is considered neutral. But neutrality itself is an arrangement. At this point in the archive, the original schoolteacher's photograph is rarely referenced directly. It exists more as a catalog entry than a subject of analysis. Yet when it is revisited, it remains unchanged. A still moment, a partial erasure, a figure between instruction and silence, and perhaps what makes it persist in archival memory is not what it shows, but what it fails to resolve. Because nothing in the image confirms what was being taught in that exact moment, only that something was in transition, and transition is rarely captured fully in institutional records. It is usually documented before or after, rarely during, which leaves the final return to the photograph not as closure but as re-examination. The desks still aligned, the chalk still half erased, the teacher still paused between motion and instruction, and the question, still unresolved in the surrounding documentation, remains present in its absence. Not what was taught, not what was removed, but what changed in the space between speaking and silence, when instruction itself began to decide its own limits. And in that space between speaking and silence, the record finally stops behaving like a sequence of events and begins to resemble something else entirely, a pattern that was never meant to be read in full, only in fragments, because after the mid-century stabilization of curricula, the archive no longer contains abrupt interruptions like the schoolteacher's reassignment or the handwritten marginal warnings in lesson notes. Those kinds of artifacts become rare, not because they stop existing, but because they stop being preserved in the same visible way. The documentation changes its posture. Earlier records feel like they were written by people observing a system in motion. Later records feel like they are written by the system observing itself. And in that shift, the schoolteacher of 1901 becomes less of a person the archive remembers, and more of a reference point it uses to define what came before alignment. A boundary marker. But boundaries are only meaningful when something once crossed them. In a reconstructed training archive compiled decades later, there is a brief commentary attributed to an unnamed educational reviewer analyzing early transitional teaching periods. It reads, "Instruction prior to standardization contains irregular interpretive density. This density is no longer compatible with uniform evaluation structures." The phrase interpretive density is never defined further. It does not need to be. Its meaning is assumed through contrast. And contrast is how most systems preserve memory without preserving detail. By this stage, the earlier classroom photograph is often reproduced in historical textbooks as an example of early structured education environments. The caption is factual, restrained, neutral. It does not mention the partial erasure on the chalkboard. It does not mention the paused gesture. It does not mention the absence of a full name. It simply situates the image in time and place and moves on, because systems designed for continuity rarely linger on unresolved details. Yet the unresolved remains, not as contradiction, but as residue, and residue accumulates differently than information. It does not update, it does not revise, it simply persists beneath the surface of what is considered resolved knowledge. In one final archival fragment, a later historian reviewing early 20th century educational transitions writes a note that is never included in official publication. When we examine what was removed from instruction, we often assume loss, but what we rarely examine is how instruction itself changed the shape of what could be noticed in the first place. That sentence is not marked as controversial. It is simply omitted in final editing, not erased, just not carried forward. And that distinction becomes important, because omission is not always destruction. Sometimes it is selection without acknowledgement. The schoolteacher from 1901, in the end, does not remain in the archive as a figure of resistance or revelation. She remains as something quieter, a point where instruction had not yet fully separated from interpretation, a moment before teaching became primarily about alignment rather than exploration. And as the photograph is viewed again in its stillness, there is nothing new added to it, no hidden message revealed, no final correction made. Only the same arrangement of desks, the same partially erased chalkboard, the same paused gesture that neither confirms nor denies what was being said. And perhaps that is what the archive ultimately leaves behind, not a conclusion, not a suppressed truth, but a simple, persistent condition of uncertainty within something that otherwise appears complete, because every system that organizes knowledge must also decide what counts as finishable knowledge. And what remains outside that boundary does not disappear. It simply stops being noticed as part of the structure at all. The photograph remains unchanged, but the way it is seen does not. And in that difference, the story does not end. It only becomes less certain where it is being continued from